It is truly a pleasure to be here today. It really is. As someone who works in academia, I oftentimes find myself presenting in front of audiences, but this is unique and different. For the most part, I present in front of exclusively academic audiences, right? People who study communication or even study a very narrow subset of communication. And that's not the case here. We have a much more diverse group, and I'm really excited about that. As Dietram noted, I'm currently working on a literature review around this topic, and that's one of the key themes that's emerged, this idea that we can't be siloed in terms of how we attack this issue, right? To truly understand misinformation, to combat misinformation, we need to have perspectives from a variety of different people, and I think the organizers have done a fantastic job of bringing together a group of people to really tackle this issue of misinformation. Before we get too deep in the weeds, though, my job is to really give the 30,000-foot overview of misinformation. And so I'll do so by talking about 4 key areas. First, I'll spend a little bit of time defining misinformation, making sure we're all on the same page about what it is and isn't. Then I'll spend a little bit of time talking about some of the theoretical approaches, specifically the continued influence effect and motivated reasoning. Then I will look at the methodological approaches in this area. So how have we studied it and what methods are best for answering certain types of questions? And then I'll do my best to, and I have a very limited amount of time here, to summarize the notable findings in this area. So let's jump into defining misinformation. Misinformation is certainly the most common term that gets used in the literature, and it operates as something of an umbrella term or a catch-all term. And so you'll see a number of different terms pop up below it. Authors oftentimes use these interchangeably. They'll talk about things like disinformation, conspiracy theories, rumors, fake news, myths, innuendos, falsehoods. There's a host of different terms that get used in this space. The earliest definitions were quite broad in terms of how they define misinformation. It was any sort of content that was inadequate, incomplete, misleading, distorted. But since that time, we've kind of coalesced around, I think, a pretty user-friendly definition here. It's false or inaccurate information that is spread without intention to deceive. And I think that idea of lacking intent is critically important because it helps us differentiate misinformation from a term like disinformation. Disinformation is outright false information that's disseminated for propagandistic purposes. So there's an intent there, right? We can think of misinformation as the honest mistake in communication, and we can think of disinformation as fake news, trying to put things into a package to sell an idea to a group. Another term that pops up is ignorance. This is when someone is ill-informed but ultimately realizes that they're ill-informed on a topic. It's compared to a misinformed individual who thinks they have a full understanding. Their understanding is inaccurate, but they're confident in that understanding. And just as kind of an editorial aside, I think these labels matter. Ignorance is kind of a harsh term for something that I think communicators really actually, of all these different groups, I think we'd want to communicate towards the ignorant group rather than the people that are misinformed or disinformed, right? So I think this label is an interesting one, and I look forward to someone's very clever new term as we get into the Q&A of this. The last term I want to define here, I don't want to spend the time here just defining terms, misperceptions. These are false beliefs that are not supported by the best available evidence, and so they flow logically from a lot of the stuff you're seeing here, right? False beliefs flowing from misinformation and disinformation. So let's transition, talk a little bit about the theoretical approaches in this space. As promised, I'd like to start with the continued influence effect. This is the tendency for information that is revealed to be false, that is retracted, that is corrected, to continue to linger in memory and continue to impact how we think about a topic or an issue. There's a relatively small group of scholars who I think have made the most headway in this area. People like Lewandowski, Ecker, Swire. There's a few more in this space, but they're really concentrated around a relatively small group of people. They've done a number of studies, mostly experimental work, and the goal of that work is to understand the conditions under which this continued influence effect operates and does not operate. When can we overcome it, right? How can we correct information in such a way that people aren't contaminated or tainted by that misinformation? I want to quickly go through a couple of the different offered explanations for this effect. This is by definition very surface level. First is this idea that we're reluctant to dismiss information from memory unless a viable alternative is presented. So unless you give me something to fill that gap, I'm going to continue to hold on to it. You can think of this as reading a news story perhaps about a plane crash, and if in the news story we're told that there was a fuel line problem, that was the reason for the crash, and then later on we retract that information. Unless you fill that gap, unless you give people a new explanation for what's going on, for what caused that crash, they'll continue to rely on that first piece of misinformation. You have to fill the gap, or else it's going to continue to linger in memory. Another explanation for this idea that we increase the strength of misinformation when we try to retract it. Almost by definition, we have to repeat the misinformation by issuing a retraction or a correction, or by debunking it. And so that repetition of the misinformation can make it linger in memory. And then third, we have these reactance effects. This is a literature, mostly in the legal space, looking at how jurors are responding in courtroom type settings. A lawyer brings up a piece of evidence, it's deemed inadmissible, the jury is told, disregard that information, it's not relevant, it doesn't matter, we don't want you to pay attention to that, don't factor it into your decision making. People push back against that. They don't like being told what to think. So I think we'll move into the findings a little bit later, but I think we're starting to already see hints at the best way to package correcting information for people, right? We may need to repeat it without repeating the misinformation. We have to think about it in terms of how people are going to take it. Do they feel like they're being told to do something? Motivated reasoning is the other literature I want to quickly touch on. This is the biased selection and processing of content. We typically think of it around partisan issues, issues that people feel very strongly about. It operates via a few different routes. We have confirmation bias that says when people are given the freedom to choose, they're not necessarily preoccupied with finding truth and accuracy. They're interested in finding things that are agreeable, that fit their values, that fit how they view a topic or issue. We also have the prior attitude effect and the disconfirmation bias. This is how we evaluate incoming information. We evaluate supportive arguments as stronger and more compelling, and we tend to devote a lot of resources toward denigrating or attacking anything that we feel is attacking our point of view. So again, how do we package information in such a way that it's not coming across as an attack? How do we overcome this type of bias? There's a few other guiding frameworks that, just due to time limitations, I won't spend much time on. But we have things like echo chambers and filter bubbles. These are about the information environments we consume content in. And so with echo chambers, there's a lot of reinforcement of opinions based on like-minded individuals feeding content towards you, right? And so if that information happens to be false, if it fits with my narrative, if it fits how I view an issue or a topic, it can be difficult to overcome that. Worldviews and skepticism, very much linked to the motivated reasoning literature. Our values and orientations play a role in how we process incoming content and the degree to which we view people as skeptical or trustworthy. So again, when you're speaking my language, when you're telling me something I want to hear, I'm much more likely to accept it and not push back. All right, so methodological approaches in this space. There's really 4 key areas. We have content analysis work, we have network analysis work, which kind of pushes into the world of algorithm development. This is a literature that I would say I was almost wholly unaware of prior to taking on this literature review, but I think it's a really interesting one for combating misinformation. We have public opinion work as well, surveys, focus groups, and interviews. I'm kind of lumping all these together under the general frame of public opinion work. And we have experiments, kind of these causal mechanisms. How can we push back against misinformation? How do we defeat misinformation? So when we talk about content analysis work, we're primarily focusing on identifying the scope of the problem. How big of an issue do we have on our hands? Lots of work in this space in the realm of health, whether specific issues like fluoridation or very kind of general information searches around health, and driven a lot by changes in communication technology. So you see a lot of work once the internet becomes ubiquitous, once the internet is being used by people and we see them searching for health information online, there's a spike in a large number of studies trying to understand, well, what does that information environment look like, right? Is it quality information? Is it biased information? Is it fear-mongering? Is it pushing people towards maybe not scientifically based solutions to combat their health problems? And then we see another spike when you're looking at the ubiquitous use of different types of social media platforms. Vaccines is a great example. There's a lot of content analysis work looking at vaccines in the social media space, looking at Twitter, Facebook, Pinterest. Again, trying to diagnose the scope of the problem. What type of issue do we have on our hands? What type of content are people likely to encounter? The network analysis and algorithm development work operates primarily to understand misinformation spread so that we can combat it. And I would say it operates in 2 major camps. First is identifying the common features of false content versus accurate content. What does misinformation look like? What does disinformation look like? What does fake news look like? We'll look at things like the linguistic style of content. How do we phrase this type of stuff? How are we packaging it? What does disinformation look like in the online environment? Once we've identified it, there's a focus on understanding the flow of content, and network analysis is especially well suited to look at this. So what do online communities look like? What do communities of groups of people that have a history of being misinformed or a history of passing along fake news, what do those communities look like? How are they unique and different than communities that aren't getting trapped into that cycle? What are the features of misinformation or disinformation that correlate with engagement metrics? What gets shared, what gets retweeted, what gets consumed and packaged and repackaged? How quickly does content spread? How quickly do we have to react in order to stop the stem of misinformation flow? So very interesting literature in this space. There's also an interesting literature looking at how to stop this with seeding nodes within a network. So if information spreads very quickly and we know that, can we identify the key players in that space, the people that are bridges to different communities? And what can we do to stop the flow of information in that space? What can we seed them with the accurate information? Can we shut them down? And I think there's ethical questions that go along with who we shut down and how we make that determination. But are there ways that we can inject information into a system to stop it from spreading and getting out of control and infecting a large number of users? And I'm using that term infected quite a bit here. Public opinion work is mostly focused on getting a more nuanced view of the issue. You'll talk to experts, you talk to lay audiences, you may bring in a group of physicians to get a sense of what type of questions are your patients coming in with around this topic. What are their concerns? What type of content are they consuming? And what does that mean for the type of conversations you're having with them? Are they having more or less trust in you based on things they encounter in the online environment? We look at things like whether or not people can identify accurate content from inaccurate content, so fake news from other forms of content. Try to identify the people that are most vulnerable. Are there patterns in the people that are most vulnerable, whether demographically or attitudinally? And what are some of the solutions in this space? And then finally, the experimental work, probably the area where there's been the most testing of ways to stop misinformation. I've already kind of alluded to some of the retraction and correction studies, Lewandowski and that group of individuals. They look a lot at, again, how do we issue retractions? Does repetition help? What if the misinformation is repeated? Are there ways that we can make the retraction more emotionally charged to grab hold of people? So a lot of experimental work looking at that, a lot of lab-based work. The backfire effect essentially finds that when something reinforces our opinions or beliefs, debunking it can actually strengthen it. So we're trying to understand the context under which these conditions hold. At this point, most of the work I'm talking about is laboratory-based, but I'm going to put Brendan Nyhan on the stand here for a second here and just talk about a study that he's done. Really interesting one that takes this type of approach and brings it into the real world. So real-world intervention that they conducted where they sent politicians a reminder about things like fact-checking services. Some people were not given this reminder. And then they tracked their information sharing after that fact. What were they saying in their speeches? What were they being quoted as saying? And were they more or less likely to spread misinformation after being told, hey, there's things called fact checkers. We have websites like PolitiFact. They're tracking what you're saying, right? So a very interesting kind of movement away from the laboratory setting, bringing these experimental approaches into the real world. Okay, so some notable findings in this space and some advice for communicators. The first question is, how big of a problem do we have in our hands? And this is mostly the content analysis work and the network analysis work. And the answer is, I think we kind of expected this, it kind of depends, right? It depends on how you look at the issue. Different approaches oftentimes will yield the very similar conclusions. You look at the same content and we have this convergent validity where different studies have honed in and found, yes, there is a problem. Great example of this is the health communication literature. Virtually every study I came across that looked at information searches in the online environment tended to find that there is some degree of problem, and usually a fairly large problem. What people search for, it's potentially problematic. The things that pop up on the first 10 listings of Google are not necessarily the best type of content, the most truthful, accurate content. So there might be fear-mongering in this space, that type of content. Other approaches, it gets more complicated. There's been work done on Ebola on Twitter, and depending on the keyword searches employed, depending on the scope of the analysis, the time frame investigated, we either have an incredibly large problem on our hands, where virtually all content is misinformation and disinformation, or we have a relatively small problem on our hands. Yes, there are rumors, but they end up being confined to small communities. So the method really impacts how big of a problem we have here. Once again, I'm citing Brendan Nyhan and talking about his work. If you'd like to finish the conversation here, since I'm leading so heavily on your work, you're more than welcome to. They did an analysis of the 2016 presidential election and analysis of the 2018 midterms in this country. They, again, took a unique approach to it. They combined survey responses with web traffic browsing histories, looking at not just what people say, but where they were going in the lead up to the election. And there's a couple of takeaway points that I want to knock home here. First, in the context of the 2016 presidential election, they found that about a quarter of Americans had visited some form of fake news website. That was less than 10% in the lead up to the 2018 election. 2016, they found pretty strong evidence that Facebook helped spread fake news. By 2018, that pattern had kind of gone away. It wasn't that Facebook was blameless, but that they were much more on par with other platforms, with other sources of information. So they had kind of reduced their role in the process. And then finally, what they found across both data collections was that fake news consumption was ultimately most concentrated among a relatively small group of people, and people with very conservative views. And I feel like this recorded video is going to get me in trouble just for saying that sentence. But concentrated among a pretty passionate group of people, right? And so part of the argument was, well, this type of content isn't necessarily swinging elections. It's concentrated among a pretty small group of people who are going to vote the way they're going to vote, right? It wasn't that fake news infiltrated their minds and they decided to change their voting behaviors. They were likely to vote, highly likely, if not guaranteed, to vote the way they were going to vote to begin with, right? And so this is not to say we don't have a problem on our hands. And the authors themselves don't say that we don't have a problem on our hands. But sometimes the hype around it can get a little bit out of control, right? So we've seen that actions can work. We've seen that this can be reduced, the impacts and just the sheer volume of fake news that people are seeing. So there are solutions out there, and we've made a little bit of headway. Again, this is not to say we don't have a problem on our hands. Certainly the people that are out there spreading fake news are likely to continue to evolve and change how they do it. They're going to get more nefarious with this. And so we do still have a problem on our hands, a relatively small one at least. So what can we do about it? This is where I think that literature in the realm of network analysis and some of the algorithms that are being developed to spot and kind of contain fake news become really important here. We have these automated models that are being built. They are able to, with at least some degree of accuracy, and I'll talk about that in a second, identify things like the linguistic style of misinformation versus other types of content. They are able to identify the different networks in which this propagates. They understand the people who are sharing it. So we're gaining insights in this area. There's probably a publication bias here, right? The articles that I'm summarizing, the articles that I'm reading are the ones that show a kind of cost-effective, interesting solution, so they're the ones that get published. But even having said that, there is promise in this space, and they feel, through their simulations, pretty confident in their ability to at least do some identification of this content. Again, it brings up ethical questions about whether and how we do this in the real-world environment, which is the next point I want to make. The problem that I think we have in this space is that most of these simulations are exactly that. They're simulations. They have not been run on real-world data, at least not large-scale real-world data, and so there's some potential problems in that area. Can we kind of ratchet it up for the real-world environment? And the good news is, yes, at least to some degree, right? Again, I'm not an expert in this literature. I'm not an expert on network analysis and the algorithms that get developed. But there's a group at Indiana University doing some very interesting things. They're part of the Observatory on Social Media. It's a very collaborative group. They've brought together people that are computer scientists, journalists, people from the social sciences, hard science. And they've developed a series of tools for identifying things like content produced by bots versus content produced by normal, regular human beings. They are studying and learning to understand the flow of false content online, seeing the speed at which it spreads and how it spreads and the way it kind of weaves its way in and out of different social networks online. And I pulled a quote from their website here. They claim to be the first group to uncover evidence of systematic, orchestrated, and widely spread misinformation campaigns based on astroturfing, which is this idea of fake grassroots movements, and social bots. And so they have tested this in the real world. They've made it open access so people have access to a lot of these different tools. And they're encouraging people to use these tools to understand the spread of misinformation and what we can do to stop it. But inevitably, there's going to be some sort of infection, right? We can't necessarily stop all content from making it into the public conscious. So what do we do once people have been exposed to misinformation or disinformation? I noted earlier that the continued influence effect is probably the most investigated area of research as it relates to combating misinformation. The bad news first. Few, if any, studies have been able to completely eliminate the continued influence effect. Misinformation always seems to linger in memory. It always seems to have some impact even after it's been corrected. So that's the bad news. The good news is there are promising solutions out there. There are potential ways around this. And so the most promising work has been in three major areas. First, this idea that we can deliver warnings at the time of message exposure. So this is kind of like a form of media literacy training. We teach people that, yes, bad content will find its way through the cracks. It will end up in your feed. It will end up in your inbox. Then the warning can help in that regard, right? Teaching them about things like the continued influence effect itself has been found to impact the persistence of misinformation. It can lessen that impact. Again, there's practical limitations around this, right? Can we just go around yelling, be careful, be careful, be careful? People are eventually going to tune that out, right? So there's a natural problem there in the practical environment. Number two, we can strengthen retractions through repetition. So again, great. As long as we repeat ourselves and tell people that this is misinformation, that can lessen some of its impacts. The bad news is repeating misinformation tends to increase its persistence as well. So again, a natural tension there. We need to develop ways in which we're knocking down a claim, debunking a claim, but without repeating it and reinforcing it, which can be difficult to frame sometimes. And then number three, we can provide corrections that offer an alternative narrative, and there are some rules about what this narrative needs to look like. Yes, it needs to fill that gap in people's minds. This is the example of the fuel line I talked about earlier with the plane crash. We have to develop alternative narratives, deliver them to people. They have to be viable, they have to make sense in the context, and they also have to speak to why we believe the misinformation to begin with. So in the context of that airplane going down, it would be, why did we initially think it was the fuel line? What was the evidence pointing in that direction? What did we learn, and how have we been able to correct that? So why did we change our perception on that? Other trends that I think are worth highlighting in this space: sources matter. Sources who deliver the content matter. Sources who deliver the correction matter. There's at least some evidence that having information come from an unlikely source is the best approach possible. So if you have a strong Republican and there's a fake news story that would benefit that strong Republican, and that person says, no, in fact, this is fake news, that's a retraction or a correction coming from an unlikely source, right? Because it would have helped that person. So if you can get people on your side to combat this type of issue, again, difficult to do. There's not a lot of evidence that people are willing to do that. Authoritative sources matter. There's been some work that looked at the CDC issuing a corrective piece of information versus a regular user online, and some evidence that the CDC works a little better in that regard. Referencing matters. So if you can make your retraction, you can make your debunking claim, but you can cite something, you can show the paper trail about why you know this is accurate content, that can play a role. This creates some tension with some of the advice I'm going to talk about, the key one being we need to keep things simple. When you get complex, people tend to get lost in the shuffle, and they tune you out. And there's mixed evidence on fact-checking, which is something I wanted to bring up here. Recent work suggests that in certain contexts, fact-checking can work to debunk misinformation, but there's also some studies that suggest we have that backfire effect. So we need to do more investigating. We need to do more research. We need to understand the context in which we have these effects, in which we don't have these effects. When are they there? When do they persist? When do they go away? And I want to end here, I got about a minute and a half, with some suggestions for practitioners. These are not my suggestions necessarily, although they flow from research that I trust and value. These are from Lewandowski and colleagues back in 2012. They've identified a host of different things that practitioners of communication should do if they're trying to correct misinformation in someone's mind. Some of these I've alluded to or I've outright said. Number one, we need to emphasize the facts and avoid repeating the myth. So avoid repeating the false information, the misinformation. Stick to the facts. Don't get caught in long rebuttals. What we need are simple rebuttals. Deliver the information quickly, concisely, and confidently. And then the last two, we need to package the information in such a way that it's going to resonate with people. We need to package it in terms of their worldviews and their self-identity. If you don't, it comes across as confrontational, right? We have that reactance effect that I mentioned earlier. We don't like being told how to think. We don't like being told how to view an issue. And so if we package it right, we can soften the blow associated with that. And so about 40 seconds here, so we're right on time. I'll transition to any final questions you have. And of course, those suggestions for a new label of ignorance. I think that's the most important part of that.
No, that's it.